So you might be new to AEP, and if you are, you're probably spending a lot of time figuring out how to design your schema. Now, Adobe provides a lot of options to get you started with field groups, classes, and stuff like that. But sometimes you might want to think a little bit outside the box and create your own customized schema. And that means you're not using the default Adobe stuff. Now, you might do this because you want to be a little bit more intentional with how to structure your data. Now, there's nothing wrong with either methodology, and I honestly don't have a recommendation. However, you might run into a speed bump when it comes time for implementation. And that's because Alloy, the function that deploys the server call to AEP, sends in a lot of other default information. And what that means is if you're using a custom schema outside of the experience event schema, that you're going to see some failed batches. So how do we fix that with the WebSDK extension in Adobe Launch? That's what we're going to talk about in this video. It's actually a lot easier than you think, but it takes a little bit of code. So we're going to go through it pretty slowly and see what the output looks like, so you can do the same if you're creating your own custom schema within AEP. Let's take a look. Right now we're looking at my website, gymalytics.com. And what I'm going to do is something that I do pretty much every day. I'm going to refresh the page to trigger our first server call, which should be the page view. Now I'm filtering on /interact so I can isolate all of the WebSDK calls or calls to AEP. And I'm going to right click this events object and click expand recursively. And that actually expands all of the data that's housed within the payload that's being sent to AEP. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. So when I scroll down, you're going to see some values in this object like xdm.device.screen height and screen width and orientation that I haven't actually manually set within Adobe Launch. That's because what Alloy does is it takes parameters like your screen height and width, parameters like your environment and implementation name and version and stuff like that, and automatically sends that to AEP. Now, as a user of AEP, I might not necessarily want all of those values. So if I have a schema that has some of this stuff, but not all of it, or maybe I'm building something that's completely custom, if I send environment.browserdetails.viewport height, that batch is going to fail. And we want to prevent that from happening. So how do we get it? How do we set this up so that we are eliminating the values such as xdm.environment and maybe even xdm.web? So our payload doesn't have a lot of this default information that's being sent into AEP. Well, let's jump right over to Launch. So now we're in Launch and you can see the primary overview for my website. What we're going to do is go to extensions where we'll find the WebSDK extension and let's configure it. Now our goal is to modify the payload before it's sent to AEP. Now, usually what you can do is modify it in the rule. For instance, you can update the variable and maybe add or include or disclude something that might not necessarily need to be part of the payload. However, Alloy includes some specific default values like we saw just a minute ago. And what we want to do is take those values out of the payload before they're sent into AEP. And it's a little bit more complicated than just modifying a rule, but it's still not that hard. First, what we're going to do is go into the extension configuration and look for the data collection section right here. Now, there's a section below it called on before event send callback. Now, the flavor text of this says callback function for modifying data before event is sent to server. This sounds a lot like what we want. So I'm going to open up this coding prompt. Now, let's say the first thing I want to do is remove the device parameters. Now, if you remember on my blog website, device includes both screen height, screen orientation, and screen width. This isn't a very complex path that we're using here, and we want to remove it from the payload. The first thing I'm going to do is include a comment saying remove the device object from payload. And the method that we're going to use is really simple. It is just delete. And I copied this over. We're going to change event 0 to content content.xdm.device. Click save. And so what we're saying here, and you can see the code that we just typed kind of blurred out. What we're saying is we want to delete this content.xdm.device object prior to that data being sent into AEP. Now let's see if it works. So I'll go ahead and click save, and I didn't create a working library here. That was my mistake. Should have read this. Add library, and we're going to go with test removing device object under development. And this is why I always need to use a working library, is because I have a lot of changes in here that I don't want included. Now let's save and build this for development. Cool. Now I fast forwarded it past the build phase, and I actually went ahead and replaced the library with my development library on my website. So what we're going to do is refresh the page and go through this process again, like we did earlier. All right. Now let's open up that interact server call. And I'm not going to expand it recursively, just so it's easier for us to look at each of the parent objects in the XDM object. Let's open this up. Open up XDM. And you'll see that the device object is gone. Now, I'm going to quickly flip over back into launch, go to extensions, and let's say I want to remove web. So let's go through this process one more time. And just as a reminder, here is web. It exists right here. And we're going to try to remove it. Back here. Web. Save. Let's save and build. All right, it's built. Let's refresh the page. Go under Events, XDM, and boom, web is gone. So you can see how relatively easy it is to remove default objects from your payload to AEP. Now, it does kind of go against our design patterns where you want to keep everything consistent and minimize custom code. And maybe in the future they can create something that makes it easier to suppress default values that are being sent to AEP. But for now, this is easy enough and it works, and I no longer get failed batches if I'm using a custom schema. So I hope this helped, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.